Hello and welcome to the IND podcast. I'm your host, Dennis Dunicic. Subscribe to our channel to stay in the loop on the most important global affairs occurring today. Let's get right into our main story, which is actually a positive one. Most of the news that I report on is unfortunately negative, involves war, human suffering, death, or tragedy. That's just the nature of politics and global affairs. But today, I'm actually going to report on a positive story that is giving us some light in this terrible pandemic. More specifically, I'm going to talk about India and its efforts to inoculate or vaccinate the vast majority of its population, and the fact that it has been able to beat one of the worst surges of the coronavirus that has occurred globally. Now, just recently, India has managed to cumulatively provide over 1 billion doses of COVID vaccines to its population. India is the second country to be able to reach this milestone after China. Now, China is the world's most populous country and reached this milestone in June of this year. India is the world's second most populated country at 1.4 billion people, and it has finally reached this milestone. 75% of India's adult population that is eligible for vaccines has been vaccinated, and 30% of the population has been fully vaccinated from the coronavirus. In addition to this, earlier this year, some studies were done between June and July, which found that 60% of Indians have antibodies which are resistant to the coronavirus. Now, this is really good news. For those of you that have been following the coronavirus situation in India, this year, the Delta variant caused massive devastation in the country, where in some days they had more than hundreds of thousands of infections. Now, to give you some perspective on what the situation is like, today or yesterday, Wednesday, India recorded only 14,000 new cases of coronavirus. Now, this may seem like a large number, but the reality is, when you compare it to the hundreds of thousands of daily infections they were having before and India's massive population, this is really, really small and really good. Currently, active cases are only less than 1% of all of the cases India has had since the beginning of the pandemic. And since the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, India has had a total of 34 million cases, which have resulted, unfortunately, in 450,000 deaths. Now, hopefully, these deaths and these high rates of infections are finally going to be behind the country. And this is good for the rest of the world. Every country that is able to maintain the coronavirus and begin to develop herd immunity brings the entire global population one step closer to finally ending this pandemic. Now, that being said, there is still some worry, cause, and concern. There can always be new variants of the coronavirus that can come that are more resistant to vaccines. There's still a significant amount of India's population that has not been vaccinated or has not developed a natural resistance to coronavirus. So while this is a cause for celebration, it is still a cause for concern. So I'm just going to go into detail of how India was able to fight this massive surge of the Delta variant and coronavirus in general and find itself in the positive situation that it is today. At the beginning of this year, the Health Ministry of India instituted and initiated a massive vaccine drive, which in the past few months, they've invested more money, more time, and more effort into making sure that they can inoculate or vaccinate as much of the eligible adult population as possible. And so far, it's been relatively successful. Now, that being said, at the beginning of this year, the Health Ministry of India stated the goal of wanting to vaccinate all eligible Indian adults by the end of the year. Now, logistically and statistically, this probably is not going to happen. It's probably not possible. It could potentially happen if the government increases its efforts even more, but likely that's not going to occur. Still, though, this is a massive achievement, and one that the government is going to commemorate massively. Keep in mind, this is a major collective success. It's not just something that came from the health ministry or health workers. It came from the responsibility of Indian citizens willing to get the vaccine and to prevent the spread of the virus in their country, so life could finally go back to normal. Now, famously, on social media, videos were shown at the beginning of the pandemic of how strict India's lockdown was. People were not able to leave their homes. Even stores were set up in apartment buildings so people would not leave their residential complex to even go shopping. And individuals that did, famously on social media, were whipped by Indian police. It's good to see, finally now, that a vast majority of the Indian population has natural resistance or a vaccine resistance to the virus, and life can finally go back to normal. Now, the government is celebrating this by the health ministry going to institute a song and a video to celebrate this achievement. In addition to this, today on Thursday, there's going to be celebrations held at hospitals and vaccination centers to celebrate the frontline healthcare workers that have been fighting during this COVID pandemic, that have been providing vaccines, and that have been giving healthcare to COVID patients. And they've been doing a lot of work, especially this year. The Delta variant was so bad that hospitals were flooded with patients. And not just hospitals, but crematoriums and funeral homes simply could not accept all of the dead patients of coronavirus to cremate them. The situation was terrible. Today, it is much better. In addition to the celebrations and the music video that's being released by the health ministry, the Indian government is going to raise the Indian flag over the historically important Red Fort in New Delhi. Now, to give you some context, the Indian flag is typically only raised over the Red Fort on India's Independence Day, one of its most important national holidays. And it does this to celebrate its national unity and ability to overcome odds such as imperialism and oppression. This is symbolically going to represent the collective efforts of the Indian people to defeat coronavirus. And defeat it they have. Life in India has significantly gone back to normal. Markets and bazaars, shopping centers, restaurants, bars are full of people. They're finally living life in relative normality. In addition to this, tourists are finally able to visit India again, which is a huge thing. Tourism was banned. Tourists were not allowed to enter India for 19 months. More than a year and a half, there was a restriction on tourists coming into India. Now, India has become one of the world's most industrialized and advanced economies, but it is still developing. And one of the major industries that's developing in India has been tourism. COVID-19, very, very negatively affected this by completely blocking off tourism. Now, India is open for tourism, which is good for its economy, it's good for travelers who want to experience India, and it's simply good for morale of the people who have collectively defeated this virus. And finally, symbolically, people are beginning to prepare for one of the most important holidays in Hinduism, which is Diwali. Now, Diwali is the celebration of light, or more specifically, the victory of light versus darkness, or the victory of good versus evil, the victory of knowledge versus ignorance. But this year, Diwali can be viewed as the victory of collective action against the COVID pandemic, and the victory of people working together to bring life finally back to normal. And this shows the rest of the world that the virus can actually be beaten and that we can finally begin getting life back to normal, maybe sooner than we even thought. Now, another thing that should be noted, India is one of the world's largest producers of vaccines. And when the Delta variant was ravaging the country and causing hundreds of thousands of infections on a daily basis, India stopped its exports of the vaccines, which hurt a lot of other countries which were dependent on the production of vaccines in India. Now, India has begun the export of vaccines again. The government has stated that it is extremely confident in the nation's ability to produce enough vaccines to meet both the domestic needs of India's people and to meet its international needs and international partners' needs and cooperations. This is good. And more specifically, India's two largest vaccine producers have stated that they are producing a major amount of vaccines. The largest is producing about 220 million jabs a month, and the second largest is producing 30 million vaccines a month. This is a major number that is most likely going to be able to provide for the Indian people and provide for its international partners. So this is a really good story. And VK Paul, who is the chief and the director of the COVID response force in India, has said that this is a major national victory. But I do want to end this positive story a little bit cautiously. Now, as you all know, and everyone in the world has been following the coronavirus pandemic, and not just in India, but all over the world, the situation is extremely dynamic. And I mean that in a very bad way. Things with the COVID pandemic and the coronavirus vaccine production can change in an instant. And there has to be cautious optimism moving forward. Still, a significant amount of India's population is not fully vaccinated. Only 30% is. They have to bridge the gap between the 30% that is fully vaccinated and the 75% that has only received one jab. And the eventual goal is to vaccinate all of the eligible adult population and create herd immunity. And this is good. When India is able to control this virus, the world's second most populated country, it makes it significantly less likely for new variants to develop and travel to other countries in the world, making this pandemic even more prolonged. And when a nation is able to develop enough vaccines to send to other partner countries, and eventually nations that do not have vaccines, primarily if you look at Africa, where only 3% of the population in Africa has received only one dose of any vaccine, it creates a situation where we can finally begin to tackle the pandemic on a global scale with global cooperation. And as I've said before, bring life back to normal. Now, maybe I'm being too positive. Maybe I'm not being pessimistic enough. Maybe I'm just happy to finally give you guys a happy story and a positive story. But I want to know what you think. Do you think this is actually going to mark the end of the coronavirus in India? Do you believe that the virus is going to finally be taken care of in the world? When do you think we're going to get back to living a normal life? Now, no one wants to live under the restrictions of COVID passes, of what in some countries has become forced vaccinations, lockdowns, etc. That has been a collective global nightmare that we want to finally move away from. I look at this a little bit more positively, and I honestly do believe that within the next 6 months, life is relatively going to be back to normal. But let me know what you think in the comment sections, and let's have a constructive debate on this topic and talk about it. Now, I want to keep in mind and remind you that coronavirus is an extremely divisive topic, and there are a lot of opinions. Some of those opinions obviously promote fake news or conspiracy theories, and I'm open to any kind of ideas, and I like to have any kind of debate, but let's try and stick to the science here. Let's try and stick to the facts and stick to what's been going on. I thank you for tuning in. I'm finally happy to give you guys a happy story, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Subscribe to our channel.